It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when my entire world shifted on its axis. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just clearing out the attic like I'd been promising my daughter I'd do for the past 3 years. Dust motes danced in the thin streams of autumn light coming to a small window, and the air smelled of old cardboard and forgotten time. Box after box of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, clothes from decades past. Then I found it, tucked inside a water-stained shoebox beneath my old Navy dress uniform. A photograph I had no memory of ever seeing before. The photo was standard military issue, the kind they took at every posting, every assignment. Rows of young men in Navy dress whites. Standing at attention, the American flag prominent in the background. San Diego Naval Base, according to the stamp on the back. July 1971. I recognized myself immediately. Third from the left in the second row. 23 years old, fresh face and proud. My whole life ahead of me. But it was a man standing directly beside me, just to my right, that made my hand start to shake so violently I nearly dropped the photograph. Those eyes, that smile, the slight cleft in the chin that ran in our family. The way his left ear stuck out just a fraction more than his right. Every detail, every feature was achingly, impossibly familiar. It was Thomas, my brother Thomas, the brother who had vanished without a trace in the summer of 1969. 2 full years before this photograph was taken. The brother we had mourned, searched for desperately, and eventually been forced to accept as lost forever. Yet there he was, standing in his own Navy whites, shoulder to shoulder with me in a photo I couldn't remember being taken. My mind raced through possibilities, each more impossible than the last. Could it be someone who just looked like him? No. The resemblance was too exact, down to the small scar above his right eyebrow from when he fell off his bike at age 12. Could the date on the photo be wrong? I checked again, my reading glasses perched on my nose. July 18, 1971. I had definitely been at San Diego then. I had the records to prove it. But Thomas? Thomas had been gone for 2 years by then. I grew up in Boston, in a modest 3-bedroom house in Dorchester that my parents bought in 1948, right after the war. Thomas was 2 years older than me, born in 1947, while our father was still readjusting to civilian life after serving in the Pacific. We were inseparable as boys, sharing a bedroom until I was 14, staying up late whispering about our dreams and plans of future. We both loved the ocean, probably because Dad used to take us fishing off Nanasket Beach every summer. Thomas used to say he'd join the Navy one day, see the world, make Dad proud by serving like he did. The summer of 1969 started like any other. Thomas was 22, working at the shipyard, saving money, talking about maybe going to college on the GI Bill if he enlisted. I was 19, working construction during the day and taking classes at the community college at night. Our younger siblings, Mary and Patrick, were still in high school. Mom worked as a secretary at the parish church, and Dad managed a hardware store in Quincy. We weren't rich, but we had everything we needed, and we had each other. Then, on June 14, 1969, Thomas left the house after breakfast saying he needed to take care of some business downtown. He seemed distracted, maybe a little nervous, but not alarmed. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt and carried his worn leather wallet. He said he'd be back for dinner. He never came home. The first night, Mom wasn't too worried. Thomas was an adult, after all, and sometimes young men stay out late. But when he didn't show up for his shift at the shipyard the next morning, and his supervisor called the house, the fear set in. Dad called the police. They took a report, but said they had to wait 24 hours. Those 24 hours turned into 48, then a week, then a month. Search parties combed the neighborhoods. His photo was in the newspaper. Tips led nowhere. The police theorized he might have gotten into trouble, maybe owed money to the wrong people, but they found no evidence of anything. It was as if Thomas had simply evaporated into thin air. Mom never recovered. She kept his room exactly as he left it, his bed made, his red socks pendant on the wall, his stack of hot rod magazines on the nightstand. Every night for years, I'd hear her crying softly in her bedroom. Dad threw himself into work, sometimes pulling 16-hour days just to avoid coming home to the suffocating grief that filled our house. Mary became withdrawn, stopped hanging out with friends. Patrick acted out, got into fights at school. And me? I felt like I'd lost my right arm. Thomas had been my protector, my best friend, the person who understood me better than anyone. By the spring of 1970, against Mom's desperate protests, I enlisted in the Navy. She begged me not to go, terrified of losing another son. But I needed to escape, needed purpose, needed to feel like I was honoring Thomas somehow by following the dream he'd talk about so often. Dad drove me to the recruitment center in silence, shook my hand firmly when we said goodbye, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time in my life. I shipped out for basic training in June 1970, exactly 1 year after Thomas disappeared. Boot camp was brutal, but exactly what I needed. The physical exhaustion left no room for grief. I excelled, made it through, got assigned to the USS Constellation as a communications technician. By early 1971, I was stationed at Naval Base San Diego, working long shifts monitoring radio traffic, living in the barracks with dozens of other young men who became like brothers. I rarely came home. The pain of seeing Mom's hollow eyes in Thomas's untouched room was too much to bear. Now, holding this photograph in my 72-year-old hands, surrounded by dusty boxes in my attic, I felt that same confusion and pain flooding back after 5 decades. How was this possible? How could Thomas be in this photo? I searched my memories of that time, July 1971, try to recall anything unusual, any moment that might explain this. But there was nothing, just routine days of work, of eating in the mess hall, of shore leave spent drinking cheap beer with my buddies. I climbed down from the attic, my knees protesting every step, and went straight to my den. Somewhere in there, I knew I still had my old sea bag with my service records and personal effects from my Navy days. I tore through the closet until I found it, pulled out my service diary, a worn leather journal I kept sporadically during my time in the service. My hands trembled as I flipped to the entries from July 1971. Most entries were brief, mundane notes about duty shifts and weekend plans. But there, on July 20th, 2 days after the photo was dated, I'd written something strange. Head still foggy. Doc says the medication should wear off soon. Can't shake the feeling I'm forgetting something important. I had no memory of writing those words, no recollection of being on medication or feeling foggy. What had happened to me? And could it be connected to Thomas being in that photograph? What do you think happened? Drop truth in the comments if you believe families deserve to know what really happened to their loved ones. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button because you'll want to hear how this mystery unfolds. The photograph haunted me for days. I'd pick it up, study every face, every detail, hoping something would trigger a memory. At night, I'd dream of Thomas, of that summer of 1969, of all the questions that were never answered. My wife Patricia noticed my distraction, the way I'd zone out during dinner, lost in thought. When I finally showed her the photo and explained who I thought was standing next to me, she looked at me with a mixture of concern and sadness. "Honey," she said gently, placing her hand over mine, "are you sure it's him? You've told me how much you miss Thomas. Could your mind be seeing what your heart wants to see?" I'd considered that possibility, turned it over and over in my mind. But no, this wasn't wishful thinking or an old man's failing memory. That was Thomas, as sure as I was sitting there. I decided I needed answers, real answers, not just speculation and fading memories. I started with what I knew, the other men in the photograph. Using a magnifying glass, I studied each face, looking for anyone I might recognize. A few faces seemed vaguely familiar, ghosts from a past I'd mostly left behind. I turned to my computer, something I'd learned to use reluctantly in my retirement, and found several Facebook groups for Navy veterans from the early 70s. I posted the photograph, explaining that I was trying to locate anyone who might have served at San Diego Naval Base in July 1971, particularly anyone who remembered the circumstances of this photo. Within hours, responses started coming in. Most were sympathetic, but unhelpful, fellow veterans wishing me luck in my search. But a few messages stood out. A man named Jim Kowalski commented that he thought he recognized the photo, said he'd been stationed there around that time. We exchanged private messages, and he agreed to a phone call. When we spoke, Jim's voice was gravelly, whether by age and, I suspected, too many cigarettes. He remembered the base, remembered the long shifts and the heat of Southern California summers. But when I mentioned the name Thomas Mitchell and described my brother, his memory failed him. There were hundreds of guys rotating through that base, Jim explained apologetically. Young faces all started to look the same after a while. But I'll tell you something odd now that you mention it. I do remember hearing rumors back then about guys who weren't in the regular system, if you know what I mean. Guys doing classified work, intelligence stuff related to the Soviets. They'd float in and out, sometimes under different names or with scrub records. It was the Cold War, man. Paranoia was at an all-time high. Those words stuck with me long after our call ended. Classified work. Scrub records. During the Cold War, I knew the government had run countless secret operations. Could Thomas have been involved in something like that? It seemed impossible, but then again, everything about this situation was impossible. I reached out to more veterans, made more calls, sent more emails. Some conversations led nowhere. Others were frustratingly vague. Men whose memories had faded or who seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of their service. But a pattern started to emerge. Several people mentioned that San Diego had been a hub for naval intelligence operations during that period, particularly related to Soviet submarine activity in the Pacific. One man, Robert Chun, who had worked in personnel, mentioned that there were occasionally records that seemed incomplete or had pages mysteriously missing. It wasn't common, Robert told me during a video call, his face pixelated on my computer screen, but it happened, usually with guys involved in sensitive operations. Their files would have gaps, or sections that were redacted or removed entirely. Made hell when we needed to verify service records, but we were told not to ask questions. That's when I decided I needed to go directly to the source. The National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis housed military service records for millions of veterans. I'd heard the bureaucracy could be nightmarish, but I had to try. I submitted a request for both my complete service record and, on a desperate hope, any records associated with Thomas Mitchell, born 1947, possibly enlisted in the Navy. While waiting for the records request to process, which I was told could take months, I took a different approach. I drove 3 hours to the National Archives facility in Waltham, Massachusetts, hoping their military records section might have something useful. The building was imposing, all concrete and glass, and inside it smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. An archivist named Eleanor Patterson, a woman probably in her late 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, agreed to help me search. We spent an entire afternoon going through microfilm records, service rosters, and base assignment logs from 1971. My official record was there, complete and detailed. But when we searched for Thomas, we found nothing. No enlistment record, no service jacket, nothing. That's unusual, Eleanor murmured, adjusting her glasses as she scrolled through another database. Even if someone washed out of basic training or was dishonorably discharged, there'd be some record. It's as if your brother never enlisted at all. But then she found something. A roster from San Diego Naval Base, July 1971, showing temporary duty assignments. My name was there, listed under communications. And 3 lines below it, partially obscured by a smudge or deliberate mark, was another name. T. Mitchell, TDY classification level redacted. TDY meant temporary duty assignment. Someone with the initials T. Mitchell had been temporarily assigned to San Diego in July 1971, but whatever their actual role was had been classified and redacted from the public record. Eleanor printed the page for me, and I stared at it until my eyes hurt. During the Cold War, Eleanor said quietly, her voice dropping as if we were discussing state secrets, the military ran numerous black operations, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance missions, things the public never knew about and might still not know about. If your brother was involved in something like that, his records could have been sealed or destroyed. It wasn't uncommon, though it wasn't exactly legal either. But national security trumped record-keeping protocols. I drove home that evening with more questions than answers, but now I had a thread to pull, a tangible piece of evidence that something unusual had been happening. Thomas had been there, in San Diego, in July 1971. The official records proved it, even if they didn't explain it. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed. I neglected my garden, forgot about the weekly poker game with my buddies, barely touched the mystery novels I usually devoured. Patricia worried, suggested I might need to talk to someone, but I couldn't let this go. Not now that I knew Thomas had been alive in 1971, had been serving somehow, somewhere, while we all thought he was dead or lost forever. You've been amazing sticking with the story so far. I know it's a lot to take in, trying to piece together something that happened over 50 years ago. But I promise you, what I discovered next changed everything I thought I knew about my brother, about my own service, about the sacrifices people made in silence during those Cold War years. The real story, the truth that was kept from my family for decades, was about to surface. Make sure you're subscribed because you won't believe where this goes next. It was a Wednesday morning in late November when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd let those go to voicemail, too many scammers and robocalls these days. But something made me answer. Is this Joseph Mitchell? The voice on the other end was male, older, with a slight tremor that comes with age. Speaking, I replied cautiously. My name is Richard Sullivan. I'm a retired naval commander. I saw your post in the Veterans of San Diego Facebook group, the one with the photograph from 1971. I think we need to talk. It's about your brother Thomas. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles turning white. You knew Thomas? There was a long pause, the kind of silence heavy with weight and regret. I did, and I've carried the truth about what happened to him for 53 years. If you're willing to meet with me, I'll tell you everything. But not over the phone. Some things need to be said face to face. We arranged to meet 3 days later at a small cafe in Providence, Rhode Island, roughly halfway between us. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. I told Patricia about the call, and she insisted on coming with me, worried that this might be some kind of cruel hoax or that the emotional weight of whatever I might learn would be too much to bear alone. I agreed, grateful for her steady presence. The cafe was called Harbor Lights, a quiet place with exposed brick walls and the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls. We arrived 15 minutes early, but Commander Sullivan was already there, sitting at a corner table away from the windows. I recognized him immediately, even though he was now in his mid-80s. He'd been in the photograph, too, standing in the back row, third from the right. His hair was white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He stood when he saw us approach, extending a weathered hand. Joseph, thank you for coming. Mrs. Mitchell, he nodded to Patricia. His handshake was firm despite his age, the grip of a military man. We sat, ordered coffee we didn't really want, and then Richard Sullivan began to speak. What he told us over the next 2 hours shattered everything I thought I knew about 1969, about Thomas's disappearance, about my own time in the Navy. Your brother didn't disappear in June of 1969, Richard began, his voice low and measured. At least not the way your family was led to believe. Thomas was recruited. Recruited? I interrupted. By who? For what? Richard held up a hand. Let me start from the beginning. In early 1969, Naval Intelligence was running a highly classified operation codenamed Silent Watch. The Soviet had dramatically increased their submarine activity in the Atlantic and Pacific, and we needed intelligence officers who could go deep undercover, sometimes for extended periods, gathering information on Soviet naval movements, capabilities, and intentions. These weren't regular Navy personnel. They were civilians or service members who could be, for lack of a better term, erased from the official record. I felt like I was hearing this through a fog, the words not quite making sense. You're saying Thomas was a spy? An intelligence operative? Yes. He was recruited in May of 1969. They approached him because of his work at the shipyard, his knowledge of naval engineering, and his clean background. He was also young and unmarried, which made him ideal. They offered him a chance to serve his country in a way that truly mattered, but it came with a price. He had to vanish. Completely. His family couldn't know, for their own safety and for the integrity of the operation. Patricia's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight. I felt numb, disconnected from my own body. So when he left that morning, when he said he had business downtown, he was meeting his handlers, Richard confirmed. They staged his disappearance, made it look like he'd simply walked away from his life. The police investigation was real, but it was designed to go nowhere. Thomas underwent intensive training for several months, learned Russian, studied Soviet naval procedures and technology. By early 1970, he was operational. But the photo, I managed to say, my throat tight, July 1971. Why was he at San Diego? Why was he standing next to me? Richard's expression softened, and I saw a genuine sadness in his eyes. That's where the story gets complicated, and it's why I felt guilty for over 50 years. Thomas found out you'd enlisted, that you'd been assigned to San Diego. It ate at him, knowing you were so close, knowing he couldn't see you, couldn't explain, couldn't let you know he was alive. He broke protocol. He pulled strings, called in favors, and arranged a temporary assignment to San Diego in July of 1971, just for a few days. He wanted to see you, even if he couldn't talk to you directly, even if you couldn't know who he really was. But I don't remember him, I said, my voice breaking. I don't remember seeing him or talking to him. If he was there, why don't I remember? Because of me, Richard said, and now his voice carried the weight of genuine anguish. I was Thomas's handler, his supervising officer for Silent Watch. When I found out what he'd done, coming to San Diego, risking the entire operation to see a brother, I panicked. The protocols were clear, absolute secrecy, or the whole network could be compromised. But Thomas had already made contact with you. You had lunch together in the mess hall, talked for nearly an hour. He told you everything. The world seemed to tilt. What? You spent an hour with your brother, Joseph. He broke down, told you he was alive, told you about the operation, begged you to keep it secret. You were overjoyed, shocked, angry, all at once. But you understood the stakes. You agreed to keep it quiet. That photograph was taken the next day, Thomas's last day on base before he had to ship out again. But I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk you telling someone, even accidentally. So I had the medical officer put something in your evening meal that night, July 19th, a drug that causes short-term retrograde amnesia. When you woke up the next morning, you had no memory of seeing Thomas, no memory of your conversation, no memory of the photo being taken. We told you that you'd had a reaction to some pain medication for a shoulder injury you'd reported a few days earlier. You accepted it. I sat there, stunned into silence. Memories that didn't exist, stolen from me. An hour with my brother, our only time together as adults, and it had been erased from my mind like it never happened. Rage built in my chest, hot and suffocating. You drugged me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You stole my memories of my own brother. I did, Richard said, meeting my eyes without flinching. It's the most shameful thing I've ever done in my life. I followed orders, told myself it was necessary for national security. But it was wrong. I robbed you of something precious, and I've never forgiven myself. Patricia was crying quietly beside me. I felt tears on my own cheeks, but didn't bother wiping them away. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, why after all these years? Richard reached into a leather satchel beside his chair and pulled out a manila folder, worn and aged, because Thomas made me promise. Before his last mission, he gave me this and made me swear that if anything happened to him, I'd find you someday and give it to you. He said you deserved to know the truth, deserved to know that he never stopped being your brother, even when he couldn't be there. He slid the folder across the table. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were photographs, several of them from that day in July 1971. Thomas and me, sitting in the mess hall, both of us smiling. Thomas and me, standing outside the barracks, his arm around my shoulder. The official group photo I'd found in my attic, but also candid shots from before and after. And beneath the photos, letters. At least a dozen letters, all addressed to me, all in Thomas's handwriting, all dated between 1969 and 1972. He wrote to you constantly, Richard said softly. He couldn't send the letters, obviously, but he wrote them anyway. Told you about his missions, about the things he saw, about how much he missed you and the family, about how proud he was when he heard you'd enlisted. Even though it terrified him that you might end up in danger, he kept them all, made me promise I'd deliver them to you if anything happened. If anything happened, I repeated, my voice hollow. What happened, Commander Sullivan? Where's Thomas now? The old man's face crumpled, decades of guilt and sorrow breaking through his military composure. I'm so sorry, Joseph. Thomas died on February 17, 1972. His submarine was conducting a reconnaissance mission in international waters near the Kamchatka Peninsula. There was an incident, an encounter with Soviet forces. I can't give you the classified details, but there was an explosion, a fire. 5 men died, including your brother. It was ruled a mechanical failure in the official report, but that was a cover story. The mission couldn't be acknowledged. The confrontation couldn't be made public. Cold War politics. The men who died that day, including Thomas, became ghosts. No military funeral, no flag-draped coffin, no memorial. Just silence. I couldn't breathe. All these years, all these decades, I'd held on to a small, irrational hope that maybe Thomas was out there somewhere, alive, maybe with amnesia or living a new life. Now that hope was ashes. He was a hero, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. He and the other men on that mission gathered intelligence that potentially prevented a major conflict. They saved lives, possibly prevented a hot war with the Soviets. But their sacrifice could never be acknowledged. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We sat in that cafe for another hour. Richard told us what he could about Thomas's service, the missions he could declassify now that the Cold War was over and most of the principals were dead. He told us that Thomas had been excellent at his work, brave and resourceful, that he'd earned commendations that would never be officially recorded. Then his final letter, written days before his last mission, Thomas had written about his little brother Joseph, about how proud he was, about how he hoped that one day I'd understand why he'd done what he did. When we finally left, Richard stood and saluted me, a crisp formal salute that held decades of respect and regret. Your brother served with honor, he said, and I'm sorry I took those memories from you. But I hope these letters, these photographs, give you back a piece of what was stolen. Patricia drove us home. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the folder to my chest. Thomas's letters pressed against my heart. I didn't speak the entire drive. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything, trying to reconcile the brother I'd known as a boy with the man who'd become a secret operative, who'd risked everything to see me one more time, who died in service to a country that could never acknowledge his sacrifice. That night, I read every letter. Thomas's voice came through in the words, his humor, his warmth, his pain at being separated from a family. He wrote about missing Mom's cooking, about wondering if Dad still went fishing, about hoping Mary and Patrick were doing well in school. He wrote about the fear he felt on missions, the loneliness of a life lived in shadows. But mostly he wrote about me, about his baby brother, about memories of our childhood, about pride and love, and hope that someday, somehow, we'd be together again. We never got that chance. But through those letters, through Richard Sullivan's confession, I got my brother back in a way I never expected. Not the living, breathing Thomas I dreamed of finding, but the truth of who he was, what he'd done, and how much he loved his family even when he couldn't be with us. The weeks following my meeting with Richard Sullivan were a blur of emotions. Some days I felt an overwhelming grief, mourning Thomas all over again, but with the added weight of knowing exactly how and when he died. Other days I felt a fierce pride, knowing my brother had been a hero, had served his country in ways most people would never know. And some days I felt anger, hot and bitter, at a government that could take someone's son, someone's brother, and erase them from existence like they'd never mattered at all. I knew I had to tell the family, or what was left of it. Mom had passed away in 1998. her heart finally given out after decades of grief and wondering. Dad followed her in 2003, his last words reportedly asking if anyone had heard from Thomas. They died never knowing what had really happened to their firstborn son, and that knowledge haunted me. But there were others who deserved to know the truth. My sister Mary was living in Florida now, 71 years old, a grandmother several times over. I called her and asked if I could visit. When I arrived at her comfortable retirement community home in Sarasota, she took one look at my face and knew something significant had happened. We sat on her screened-in porch, drinking sweet tea, and I told her everything. Mary cried, deep racking sobs that seemed to come from her soul. All those years, she kept saying, all those years we thought he'd just left us, that maybe he hadn't loved us enough to stay. And he was out there, serving, dying, and we never knew. He loved us. I said firmly, showing her the letters, read these. He never stopped loving us. Patrick, our younger brother, now 70 years old and living in Arizona, had a different reaction. When I flew out to tell him, he was furious. He'd spent decades angry at Thomas for disappearing, for abandoning the family, and learning the truth didn't immediately erase that anger. They had no right, he raged, pacing his living room. The government had no right to take him, to lie to us, to let Mom and Dad die without knowing. It's unforgivable. I understood his anger, because I felt it too, but I also understood something else, something that had taken me weeks to process. Thomas had made a choice. He'd been given an option, told what it would cost, and he decided that serving his country was worth the sacrifice. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right that his family had to pay that price too, but it had been his choice to make. Over the next few months, I worked on honoring Thomas in the way he deserved. I couldn't get his name added to any official memorial. The mission was still classified in key respects, and the Navy wouldn't budge on that. But I could create something private, something for our family, and for anyone who might one day want to know the truth. In my backyard, in the corner near the old maple tree, I created a small memorial garden. Patricia helped me design it, her artistic eye making sure it would be both beautiful and meaningful. We planted a white oak tree, Thomas's favorite from when we were kids, the kind that grew near Nanasket Beach where Dad used to take us fishing. Around the base of the tree, we placed a simple granite marker about 2 feet tall. The inscription read, Thomas William Mitchell, 1947 to 1972, United States Navy. He served in silence so others could live in peace. Forever loved, never forgotten. Beneath that, I had them engrave a small anchor, the symbol of the Navy Thomas had loved. On either side of the marker, I planted blue hydrangeas, Mom's favorite flower. Patricia suggested we add a small bench so people could sit and remember, and we found a beautiful teak bench that we positioned facing the marker. Inside the house, I created what Patricia called Thomas's Wall in my den. I had the photograph from 1971 professionally restored and enlarged, then framed it in oak. Around it, I arranged other photos, some from our childhood, others from his brief time in the Navy that Richard had given me. The letters I kept in a special archival box, but I had a few key passages professionally calligraphed and framed as well. One passage in particular spoke to me, from a letter Thomas had written in December 1971. Joey, I hope you never have to read this. I hope I make a home someday, and we can sit on the porch like old men, drinking beer and telling stories about all of this. But if you are reading this, if the worst has happened, then I want you to know that every choice I made freely. I chose to serve. I chose to accept this mission. And I'd choose it again because someone has to stand in the dark so others can live in the light. I'm proud to be that someone. And I'm proud to be your brother. Live your life, Joey. Be happy. Fall in love. Have kids. Grow old. Do all the things I might not get to do. And know that wherever I am, I'm cheering you on. Your brother always, Thomas. I read those words every single day. They gave me peace, even when the anger and grief threatened to overwhelm me. Richard Sullivan visited once more in the spring. He was visibly moved by the memorial garden, stood in front of the marker for a long time in silence. Before he left, he gave me one more thing, Thomas's dog tags. They were worn smooth, had clearly been carried for decades, and Richard pressed them into my palm with shaking hands. "These should have gone to your mother," he said. "But I kept them, told myself I would protect in the operation. But they belong with family. They belong with you." I had those dog tags mounted in a shadow box, along with a photograph of Thomas and me from 1971, and that now hangs in my living room where I see it every day. The truth about Thomas has brought our family a kind of closure we never expected to have. Mary visits once a year, and we spend a day together at the memorial, sharing stories about our big brother. Patrick came around eventually, his anger softening into a sad acceptance. He brought his grandchildren to see the memorial, told them about their great-uncle who was a hero even though they'd never learn about him in history books. I've thought a lot about the nature of sacrifice and service over these past months. Thomas gave everything, his life, his identity, his chance at a family and future, for a mission most people will never know about. He died in an incident that was covered up for reasons of national security that seemed so critical at the time, but feel almost absurd now, 50 years later. Was it worth it? I don't know. I'll never know. The intelligence he and his team gathered may have prevented a war, or it may have been just one small piece in an enormous puzzle. Does it matter? What I do know is that Thomas believed it was worth it. He made his choice with eyes open, and he never regretted it, at least not according to his letters. He missed his family desperately, grieved the life he couldn't have, but he believed in what he was doing. And in the end, isn't that all any of us can hope for? To believe that what we're doing matters, that our sacrifices mean something? I'm 72 now, the same age my father was when he died. I've lived 50 years longer than Thomas did. I gotta have the life he wrote about in that letter, the life he wanted me to have. I fell in love with Patricia, married her, raised 2 beautiful daughters. I've seen grandchildren born, watched them grow, held great-grandchildren in my arms. I've had a long career, good friends, joy and sorrow, and all the messy beauty of a full life. And through it all, I've carried Thomas with me. Before I knew the truth, I carried him as a ghost, a question mark, a wound that never quite healed. Now I carry him as he truly was, a brave man who made impossible choices and paid the ultimate price. I think about that photograph often, the one that started this whole journey. Thomas standing next to me in his dress whites, both of us young and full of hope, brothers separated by secrets but connected by blood and love. I don't remember that day, that stolen hour we had together. The drugs Richard gave me made sure of that. But in a way, I'm grateful for the photograph because it's proof that it happened, proof that for one brief moment in time, we stood together again. Sometimes, I wonder what we talked about during that hour I can't remember. Did Thomas tell me about his missions? Did we laugh about stupid things from our childhood? Did we make plans we knew we couldn't keep? Did he tell me he was scared? Did I tell him I missed him? I'll never know, and that's a loss I feel deeply. But I have his letters, and in those pages, I have his voice, his heart, his soul. I've started volunteering at the local VA hospital, spending time with veterans who don't have family, who feel forgotten. I tell them they matter, that their service mattered, even if nobody else acknowledges it. I think Thomas would appreciate that, would understand why I feel compelled to do it, because he knew what it was like to serve in silence, to sacrifice without recognition. On Thomas's birthday each year, February 8th, our family gathers at the memorial. We bring flowers, tell stories, share memories. Mary brings photos from our childhood. Patrick reads passages from Thomas's letters. My daughters, who never met their uncle but who've come to know him through his words, bring their children. We've created a new tradition, a way of keeping Thomas alive in our hearts and in our family history. Last month, I received a letter from the Department of the Navy. After some persistent inquiries, and with Richard Sullivan's help in navigating the bureaucracy, they've agreed to issue a posthumous commendation for Thomas. It can't be made public. The mission details are still classified, but the letter acknowledges his service and sacrifice. It's signed by the current Secretary of the Navy and states that Thomas William Mitchell served with distinction and honor, and that his contributions to national security were significant and valued. It's not much, but it's something. It's official recognition that Thomas existed, that he served, that he mattered. I had that letter framed and added it to Thomas's wall in my den. Sometimes I stand there, looking at his young face in the photographs, reading his words, holding his dog tags, and I talk to him. I tell him about his nieces, about his great-nieces and nephews. I tell him about how the Red Sox finally won the World Series, something we dreamed about as kids. I tell him about how Dad never stopped looking for him, how Mom never stopped setting a place at the table on Christmas, just in case. I tell him that he's forgiven for leaving, that we understand now, that we're proud of him. And sometimes in the quiet of that room, surrounded by the evidence of a life cut too short, I feel like he's there with me, like that hour we spent together in 1971. The hour I can't remember created a connection that transcends time and memory, like he's been with me all along, standing at my shoulder, just like he was in that photograph. I found a Navy photo from 1971, and the man beside me was my missing brother. That simple discovery unlocked a story of sacrifice and secrets, of love and loss, of a hero who could never be acknowledged and a family who never stopped hoping. It gave me back my brother, not in the way I dreamed, but in a way that's real and true and permanent. Thomas died in 1972, but he lives on in the memories we reclaimed, in the stories we tell, in the memorial garden, where the oak tree grows stronger every year. He lives on the values he embodied: duty, honor, sacrifice, love. And he lives on in me, in the choices I make, in the way I try to live my life with purpose and meaning. I'm 72 years old, and I finally know what happened to my brother. It took 53 years, a forgotten photograph, and a guilty conscience to bring the truth to light. But the truth, painful as it is a gift, because now I can honor Thomas properly, can tell his story, can make sure that at least his family knows that he was a hero, even if the world never will. That photograph sits on my nightstand now. Every morning when I wake up, it's the first thing I see. Thomas and me, brothers in arms, together for a moment that I don't remember, but that shaped both our lives. And every morning, I say the same thing. Thank you for your service, Thomas. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for being my brother. I love you. I'll always love you. So that's my story. The mystery that haunted me for decades, finally solved. The brother I lost, finally found, in a way. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something about your family's past that changed everything you thought you knew? Have you ever had to reconcile with painful truths that were kept secret? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's searching for answers about their own family mysteries. And if the story moved you, if it made you think about the hidden sacrifices people make, the secrets families carry, hit that subscribe button. There are so many stories out there like Thomas's, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things in silence, stories that deserve to be told, even if they can never be fully revealed. I'll be sharing more of these true, emotional journeys, and I'd be honored to have you along for them. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for honoring Thomas's memory with me. And remember, sometimes the people we think we've lost are closer than we ever imagined. Sometimes they're standing right beside us, even in photographs we don't remember being taken.